In recent decades, the memoir has been a commercially successful genre in Australia and internationally. Many scholars have talked of a memoir boom starting in the early 2000s. These memoirs range from the tell-all tales of celebrities to the tales of ordinary people who have experienced something extraordinary. Within the memoir boom, many of these memoirs have been what's been called misery memoirs, which have proven to be very popular. These often telling stories of trauma and physical and/or emotional pain experienced by the author, but they are also often presented as stories of resilience and endurance. So perhaps the most best example of how the contemporary memoir is kind of marketed, presented, and even written is this forthcoming memoir, which if you follow the Harry and Meghan saga will know that this is coming out in January of 2023. It's already being talked about. With its raw, unflinching honesty, Spare, which is the title that they've chosen for it, is a landmark publication full of insight, revelation, self-examination, and hard-won wisdom about the eternal power of love over grief. Now, whether Prince Harry talks about his experiences in Afghanistan versus the traumas of obviously his mother's death and living in the royal family is unclear, but it certainly fits and ticks a lot of the boxes of the modern memoir. The military or war memoir is a subgenre with a long history, stretching back at least as far as the Napoleonic Wars. And modern war has generated many memoirs from the perspective of the ordinary combatant, with the First and Second World Wars and the Vietnam War being particularly prolific. Publishing cycles of military memoirs have ebbed and flowed, but on the whole, these memoirs have continued to be written and published, albeit with particular distinctive features marking different publishing periods. And my broader research project in which this paper fits is a history of the Australian military memoir, which focuses both on the texts themselves, but also the publishing history of these books and how that's changed across time. So not just the content, but also how they've been published, how they've been packaged, and how they are received by their readers. The Australian military memoir has been a key way in which Australians have engaged with the story of Australia's military contributions to the post-9/11 conflicts in Iraq, and in particular in Afghanistan. They have helped to shape public understanding of these wars and helped to generate specific understanding of the meaning of these conflicts. To some extent, it can be argued they also contribute to a mythology of war, shaping our collective memory of war and fitting it into those longer traditions in Australia of Anzac, but often eliding the complex issues, conditions, and consequences of these particular conflicts. Post-2000 contemporary military stories have been a fast-growing subgenre of a broader popular growth and readership of Australian-authored non-fiction. So they very much fit into this very popular genre of Australian-authored non-fiction. And Jan Zwar did a really interesting study, which is now quite a few years ago, I think came out in 2012, in which she really talks about the popularity of Australian military history within this genre of Australian non-fiction. And then sitting within that, we can talk about these military memoirs. These memoirs function as powerful texts because they tap into the idea that the veteran, the person who has had first-hand experience of war and combat, has a special authority to write about war and to speak to the truth of war. But these memoirs are, of course, carefully shaped narratives of war, and they're produced not just by the individual putting pen to paper, but also are produced as commercial productions. Criticism of these narratives, however, remains difficult, both because of the power in Australia of the Anzac myth, and more generally, the notion that the modern soldier who has experienced war is a sacred figure. And that has also been common in America. You can't really, the thank you for your service idea, you can't really challenge these things. This may shift with our knowledge now of potential war crimes in Afghanistan, but it's unclear where that's heading. The traumas of war, now very much part of any war memoir narrative, also make it difficult to criticise these accounts or see them in a more critical way. But I think the contemporary military memoir has a number of interesting features, which place them not only into the longer tradition of the war memoir, but also fix them squarely into the current memoir boom. And so I'm going to kind of be talking about these particular memoirs that have been produced, really all as a consequence of Mark Donaldson's, I think, a consequence of Mark Donaldson's book, The Crossroad, which came out in 2013 and was very successful and really sort of paved the way for a number of these books that followed in the years following, right up until last year when Daniel Kieran's, who was most recent VC winner, published his book, Courage Under Fire. There are a number of features that distinguish these contemporary memoirs of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even the Vietnam memoirs, which continue to be published in recent years, do fall into some of the patterns that I'm going to describe, but more when they're published by the big commercial publishers rather than by smaller publishers. So Keith Payne's No One Left Behind. Keith Payne won a VC, was the last VC winner before Mark Donaldson, won a VC in Vietnam. His book was published by HarperCollins, and it falls into some of the same patterns as these more contemporary memoirs do. So Australian servicemen, and you can see these are nearly all men. I've only identified one memoir published by a woman, and it wasn't published by a major commercial publisher, have turned to writing their memoirs in very close proximity to their service, which is not always the case with other wars and their aftermath. Indeed, some of them even still serve. Mark Donaldson still serves with the SAS. Some of the others still have connections to the military or are very recently discharged from the military. So these memoirs are marked not by having the benefit of being published long after there's time to reflect on the events that they describe. They're actually being published very soon thereafter. This has the benefit of giving the stories a real immediacy, but it also plays a role in shaping our knowledge of these contentious conflicts. But of course, they're also shaped by the fact that there are many things they can't actually write about because they're still classified. So that's one feature I think that very much distinguishes these contemporary memoirs. Another thing that very much, that potentially can be pointed out with these is that they sometimes cross over into a kind of celebrity genre. For example, the VC winners, who of course get a lot of media attention when they win VCs. Mark Wales, who went on the television show Survivor and got attention if you watch Survivor. I don't know how many people do. Dan Pronk on the right there, who's been a doctor for SAS, the television show SAS Australia, since leaving the military. Or alternatively, they fall into the kind of trauma injury recovery genre, veterans who are injured usually by an IED and lose limbs. And you can see Curtis McGrath is one of them, but there are a number of those that have been published as well, which very much focus on their recovery from these injuries. Most of these memoirs are written by exceptional rather than ordinary soldiers in some respects. So they're VC winners, they're special forces soldiers. That reflects the nature of the war itself, which was much of the combat was engaged in by special forces, or those who've been injured. So in this sense, they are unlike earlier waves of memoirs, which very much are about the ordinary man sort of thrust into extraordinary events. These books are nearly always ghostwritten to some extent, although acknowledgement of this varies. Some of them do actually acknowledge their co-writer on the front cover. I think the only one there that does is Curtis McGrath, but many of them do acknowledge their co-writer or ghostwriter in the acknowledgements, but that varies considerably and is kind of one of the more interesting features of that. Interestingly as well, certain ghostwriters work across more than one of these. So Tony Park, who's a novelist who writes sort of action adventure thriller type books, has been a ghostwriter for a number of these and also for Keith Payne's Vietnam memoir. But also interestingly, these books also do a lot of, well, what I'm going to talk about now is the sort of work that the paratext does in these contemporary memoirs. And here I'm going to use the term paratext to refer to the material that is not the text itself. And in particular, I'm going to focus on cover images, endorsements, and jacket blurbs, and to talk a bit about the work that these things do in packaging and marketing these books. While paratext is not anything new to the war memoir, obviously, covers have mattered across publications. The importance of the paratext has, I would argue, increased as the commercial dimensions of these military memoirs have increased. These are published by big publishers, Pan Macmillan, HarperCollins, Allen and Unwin. And marketing them is a really important part of making sure that these books do well in the market. And the embellishments, I'm going to use the word embellishment there, of the contemporary memoir are a critical part of the text. And I would argue that they do really important work in framing these texts for consumption, for both purchasing them and for how the reader is supposed to approach them. The kind of embellishments, though, that have been applied to these texts are interesting in the sense that they also have arguably flattened out the distinctiveness of the memoir. With many of these texts being embellished in very similar ways, they tend to have a very samey kind of cover, as you can see from this selection. Endorsements invariably come from the same handful of individuals, and arguably they all start endorsing each other's books, and the same people endorse, celebrities endorse across a number of these. Matilda Gregg, writing about military memoirs, suggests that marketing and the pretty packaging of memoirs also play a role in helping to normalize war and to make it easier to digest. Arguably, all of these books play a role in sort of commercializing the experience of war. Well, I've mentioned already that the big publishers dominate. Pan Macmillan is very dominant, and I'll just show you one figure in particular who's been quite influential in bringing these books into circulation. Alex Lloyd, who is a publisher at Pan Macmillan, also runs this podcast, Life on the Line. As you can see, this is his LinkedIn profile. This is just a screenshot from a couple of weeks ago. You can see here he very much promotes his own professional profile as being about telling the story of veterans, and he clearly has done quite a lot to cultivate that the sort of military memoir list, if you like, at Pan Macmillan, and so he's a kind of interesting figure in all of this. Many of these books make mention of him in their acknowledgements. So let's have a think about some of the aspects or embellishments of these books. So I want to focus a little bit on the cover. I mean, I think it's really interesting. And if you think back to sort of Prince Harry's memoir as well, what they all sort of share are these very much, it's about the individual. You have a full face or head and shoulder shots for most of the men who have not been injured. If a man has been injured, it's almost certain that there will be a full body shot of that person on the front cover of the book, which is, to show that because usually they've lost a limb, and it will show that they are wearing a prosthetic limb. Uniforms occasionally feature, certainly for the VC winners. So Mark Donaldson is pictured there in Afghanistan. Daniel Kieran, the paperback edition is the one on the right there. That's him out in the field. The hardcover edition is the one with him standing there with all of his medals on him. They very much create a norm for the Australian Afghanistan veteran. They're white, they are probably Anglo, all of these men are pretty much from an Australian Anglo background, and of course they are male. Well, of course, this somewhat reflects the nature of contemporary book design. By no means only the military memoirs show full headshots of the individual. I think it is really interesting in the way in which all of these do this and very much highlight the individual. So military memoirs from the past are much less likely to do it. So Peter Ryan's Fear Drive My Feet, and there's many interesting, really famous memoir of World War II, really interesting cover designs, but very rarely, I mean, they don't show Peter Ryan. Barry Heard's Well Done Those Men from Vietnam, I mean, he is in that photograph presumably, but you wouldn't know which one he is. The John O'Halloran's The Platoon Commander on the right there is actually a very recent publication, and it does show him, but it's him in the field at the time. So it doesn't quite have the very confronting looks of these guys who are sort of staring out at you from these front covers. So I think that's what it really does is to help kind of emphasize this idea of these stories as being very much about the individual. It sort of shows the soldier veteran as these kind of heroic warrior individuals. So it fits very much into the kind of narrative that we've been producing around the Australian participation in Afghanistan, for better, and as we've known from the war crimes allegations, for worse as well. It also emphasises the fact that unlike previous wars, the modern soldier is a professional, and the professional military career trajectory is often dealt with in these stories as well. Combat may only take up about a third of their actual experiences in the field might take up only a third of their story, which varies quite a bit from some of the earlier memoirs. But it also conveys very much this idea of the individual as important by comparison to previous war memoirs, which very much were about the individual who's kind of swept up in these events that they can't control. There's not really that sense in these memoirs. We can also contrast these covers, interestingly, to non-combatant participation in events in Afghanistan. So Tom Gleeson went on an entertainment tour of Afghanistan and played poker with the SAS. As part of that, there's no sense of him as a person. You might know who Tom Gleeson is, but you might not. So he's not being promoted on the front cover there. Fred Smith, who was with DFAT, was a songwriter, but also spent quite a lot of time in Afghanistan during the war. Also wrote his account of that experience, but there's no sense of that being a kind of individual story or where his own face appearance kind of matters in some way. So I'll move on to thinking about endorsements now. So most of these memoirs will carry a whole lot of endorsements. So this is clearly something that contemporary publishers think is really important to selling or attracting the reader. Sorry, that's sort of got all fuzzy there on the front of Harry Moffat's book. So Harry Moffat was with the SAS. His book is marketed as a story of combat cricket in the SAS. And of course, the perfect person to promote that is Peter Fitzsimons, who is both a historian or writer who writes about both war and about sport. And his blurb, a superbly evocative story of cricket and war. It's not just cricket and it's not just war, it's both. So that's the kind of level of the kind of endorsement. They're often fairly, there's a sameness to many of these endorsements. Bear Grylls, who's the kind of survivalist kind of celebrity guy who did that television show, a powerful, honest story of courage, redemption, and finding purpose. Finding purpose is repeated in both the endorsement on the front cover as well as that kind of tagline, forging resilience, finding purpose, mastering transformation. Brendan Nelson. So there's sort of, several typical writers of endorsements. So fellow memoirists, so they write for each other. So that's quite common. Daniel Kieran wrote on Keith Payne, wrote an endorsement for Keith Payne's, for example, most recently. These kind of writers or celebrities who sort of seem to be fit for endorsing these books, Peter Fitzsimons and Bear Grylls. And if there are politicians, it will usually be Brendan Nelson. So Brendan Nelson's endorsed just about all of these, I think. And clearly, I don't know whether he gets paid for it. He probably doesn't. But it's interesting. I mean, he's there as a politician, but of course he's also there as director of the former director of the Australian War Memorial, and he has an interest in that, obviously. But what he often does in his endorsements, and I think this is quite important to how these stories are often framed, is that the stories are often pitched. Yes, they're a story about war, but they're also this kind of personal story of sort of overcoming difficult circumstances, as Mark Wales's front cover says, forging resilience, finding purpose, mastering transformation. There's often a sense that this is what the book's purpose is. It's about, helping you in your life as an individual, regardless of your circumstances or who you are. And then there's also a sense that these are about making you a better Australian. So they kind of feed into this idea of a notion of citizenship, I suppose. And Brendan Nelson often will say things like that, so you'll read this and you will be inspired to be a better person and a better Australian. I did read it. I'm not sure that I'm either a better person or a better Australian for having read it, but it was a curious and interesting journey. But I'm not going to comment much on the content of these, but this is very much part of the kind of marketing of these modern memoirs, and indeed the writing of these modern memoirs. They're not just about telling a story of war, they're also about telling a story about sort of personal transformation. And that very much fits into these modern memoirs. And going back to Prince Harry's, we'll no doubt see quite a bit about his journey, and journey is a word that we see associated with these as well. So I don't have probably enough time to also talk about blurbs, but the blurbs themselves also kind of reiterate a lot of these kind of tropes, if you like, that these memoirs kind of feed into. Extraordinary is another word that's often linked to them. Mark Mark Wales's A Story of Resilience, Testament to the Power of Transformation. So as you can see, there's a sort of sameness. I shouldn't say sameness, but these kind of ideas are repeated across many of these books. Damien Tomlinson, who lost his legs in an IED, also the story is an uplifting story of guts, drive, and exceptional resilience. So resilience is another word. His front cover, A Soldier's Extraordinary Journey. So the word extraordinary is often attached here as well. So just to conclude, scholars of the military memoir have argued that military memoirs can be vectors of militarism. To a large extent, the contemporary Australian military memoir does little to question the involvement of Australia in post 9/11 conflicts, nor to change Australia's mythology of war. The embellishments of the contemporary military memoir, such as cover designs, endorsements, and the book descriptions, all serve to provide not just a means of marketing military memoirs, but also to provide ways in which these texts are understood and consumed. Thank you.